Beneath the sunlit courtyards of Vatican City, past the columns of Bernini's sweeping embrace, there is another world. It is not marked on tourist maps, nor mentioned in the gentle murmur of guided tours. It is a labyrinth of stone, corridors older than the frescoes above them, rooms that have never seen daylight. Some are lined with shelves so heavy with age that the air tastes faintly of dust and ink. Others sealed behind doors of iron and locks that whisper when touched. In the hush of those catacombs, amid the scent of parchment and candle wax, lie whispers of a history the world was never meant to hear. Civilizations that came before the first cities of Sumer, long before the rivers of Mesopotamia saw kings rise and fall. Cultures without names in our textbooks, their monuments dissolved into the soil, their languages now dust. And yet, perhaps here, their memory survives, pressed into clay, etched on copper, or written in pigments that no alchemist can replicate today. The official record of human history begins around 5,000 years ago, when the Sumerians left behind their wedge-shaped cuneiform tablets. But what if this timeline is not a beginning, only a resumption? What if entire ages came before, rising to greatness, mastering arts and sciences, then vanishing, their remnants gathered quietly over centuries by hands sworn to silence? So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And I'd like to know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. The story begins not with Sumer, but with something far older. A fragment of fired clay, unremarkable at first glance, found in the ruins of Telbrak in northern Syria. Its markings are neither pictures nor letters, but symbols, an early accounting system, perhaps 7,000 years old, older than Sumer by millennia. Archaeologists call it proto-writing, a prelude to language on clay. It tells us there were communities capable of record-keeping before the so-called first civilization. And yet, in certain Vatican catalogues, the ones without public access codes, there are whispers of similar tablets, found in places where no excavation permits were ever granted. They appear in vague references, objects of unknown origin, impressed with script unlike known Mesopotamian forms. The origin columns are blank, the acquisition records missing. The existence of such pieces would not merely expand our timeline, it would fracture it. If a coherent system of symbols existed in regions far from the Fertile Crescent, it would mean that the idea of writing was not a single spark, but a constellation, lit in multiple places by multiple peoples, perhaps sharing ideas across distances we consider impossible for their age. Historians still debate whether such proto-writing was truly a form of communication or simply a complex mnemonic device, but in the private, some scholars admit that the earlier signs of it seem too sophisticated to be an invention without precedent, like a language already learned elsewhere. Centuries-old Vatican travel reports, filed away under the same classification codes used for missionary accounts, describe encounters with elders in remote deserts who could draw marks of ancient commerce in the sand, signs which no one in the expedition could read, but which matched certain artifacts in Rome. The documents stop there, as if the thread was deliberately cut. There is precedent for this kind of quiet custodianship. The Vatican Library already holds manuscripts no one has been allowed to read in hundreds of years. Some are sealed for theological reasons, others for political ones, and a few for reasons never stated at all. Access to these rooms is by papal decree, the names of their guardians known to only a handful of clerics. Then there is the question of context. Imagine a civilization so old that not even its ruins remain above ground. Only the fragments found far from where they were made, traded and retraded, their makers forgotten. Such fragments could be buried in ordinary museum storage, misfiled under the wrong culture, or, if deemed too disruptive, hidden entirely. One strange story, quietly dismissed by mainstream archaeologists, concerns a set of stone weights, allegedly recovered from a collapsed cavern beneath the Sinai Peninsula in the early 20th century. Their carving was unlike Egyptian, Sumerian, or Indus Valley motifs. The symbols on them had a geometric elegance, as if they were both artwork and measurement tool. The weights vanished from public record after a shipment to Rome for further study. No photographs survive, only sketches in the journal of an Italian engineer who was never heard from after returning from the excavation. A factual anchor exists in the archaeological record. There are indeed ancient cultures whose sophistication predates Mesopotamia, from the obsidian traders of Anatolia to the temple builders of Göbekli Tepe. Yet even Göbekli Tepe, at 11,500 years old, raises more questions than answers. Its stone pillars are covered in symbols we cannot read, part bestiary, part geometry, part unknown. Mainstream archaeology treats it as a ceremonial site built by hunter-gatherers on the cusp of agriculture. Others wonder whether it was a survivor's monument from an earlier forgotten age. The hypothesis gaining quiet traction among certain independent scholars is that such places are not anomalies, but scattered survivors of a much older network, a pre-agricultural civilization whose memory eroded with time, its last sparks preserved only in hidden archives. If that is true, then institutions like the Vatican may hold the only surviving bridge between these scattered remnants. Notes from travellers, translations attempted centuries ago, and the artifacts themselves, wrapped in linen and sealed in cedar boxes. Why keep such a history silent? The reasons could be theological, challenging official chronologies of humanity's origins, or simply protective, guarding delicate knowledge until it can be fully understood. Some argue that revealing proof of a civilization older than Sumer would destabilize entire disciplines, from history to linguistics, rewriting the very beginning of human story. As the corridors under St. Peter's sleep in perpetual twilight, the shelves keep their silence, and somewhere, in that silence, a clay tablet may lie whose symbols would tell us, Sumer was not the first. We were not who we thought we were, and the first cities were built on the ashes of something far older. Long before the written laws of Ur-Nammu or the epic verses carved into Sumerian clay, there was the language of marks. It lived in the grooves of bone and antler, in the impressions pressed into wet clay with reed and string, in the notches along sticks carried from one valley to another. This was not yet writing as modern historians define it, but neither was it mere decoration. It was the clay that spoke before writing, a medium carrying a meaning we may never fully reconstruct. Archaeologists often draw a neat line at around 3100 BCE, when cuneiform appears in Uruk. But scattered across Anatolia, Iran and the Levant are artifacts that challenge that clean boundary. Some are inscribed with repeated standardized symbols that seem too deliberate to be random. Others bear the unmistakable geometry of thought, grids, sequences, patterns that imply a system. One such find came from the Neolithic settlement of Vinča, along the Danube in modern Serbia. Small ceramic tablets, dated to roughly 5500 BCE, bear symbols not known in any later script. They appear in consistent sequences, suggesting meaning, yet no bilingual Rosetta Stone exists to decode them. Officially, scholars call these marks proto-writing, a precursor to true literacy, likely used for trade or ritual. But there is another interpretation, quieter, far less accepted in academic circles, that these marks are the fractured memory of a much older global tradition of symbolic communication. It is here that the Vatican's shadow stretches faintly into view. In the sealed portions of its archives, those catalogued in Latin and without photographic records, there are references to lamina figline cum signis anti-Babylonicis, clay plates with signs before Babylon. The few scholars who have seen them, often under oath not to publish, describe them as small, portable, and bearing linear sequences arranged in a left-to-right order. Unlike Sumerian cuneiform, these symbols are thin, almost etched rather than pressed, and often accompanied by simple pictographs of celestial bodies. One hypothesis is that these are remnants of a trade language, a universal set of marks used by wandering merchant clans who moved goods across vast prehistoric networks. If so, the Vatican's possession of such items might indicate a much wider spread of this symbolic system than archaeology has yet confirmed. But not all examples rest in Rome. In 1908, an Italian missionary in the Sudan reported finding a cluster of carved stone pebbles in a dry riverbed. The carvings, crisp despite the stone's weathering, match some of the Vinci symbols, though the site lay thousands of kilometres away. His notes mention sending 3 examples to the Curia for preservation. Those examples have never been seen in public collections, though Vatican shipping ledgers for that year contain a vague entry for mineralia cum scriptura incognita, minerals with unknown script. The strange event that still haunts this chapter in research occurred in 1962, when a construction crew working near Lake Tiberias in Israel unearthed a large limestone slab covered in deeply incised symbols. Archaeologists on site initially thought it to be early Canaanite, but under artificial light, the patterns resolved into something entirely different, an alternating sequence of triangles, dots, and angular lines repeated with almost mechanical precision. The slab was taken for study to Jerusalem, but within months it was reported misplaced during archival transfer. Whispers among researchers suggested it had been removed for religious reasons and sent northward, its trail vanishing at the gates of the Vatican Library. A factual anchor grounds this part of the story. The existence of widespread proto-writing traditions that predate Mesopotamia is no longer in dispute. Sites from Jiahu in China to Tartaria in Romania yield evidence of symbols used for record-keeping or ritual centuries, even millennia before Sumer. What remains contentious is whether these systems were isolated developments or connected strands of a single, earlier civilization's scriptural heritage. Historians still debate whether the repetition of symbols across continents is coincidence, a product of similar human minds solving similar problems, or evidence of contact between distant peoples long before recorded trade. Mainstream consensus leans toward independent invention, but there is an undercurrent of dissent among certain epigraphers who note the statistical improbability of certain symbol sequences appearing in both Old Europe and prehistoric China without some form of exchange. In the Vatican's internal notes, the few that have leaked into public view through scholars' memoirs, there is mention of a comparative symbolum project begun in the early 20th century. It allegedly sought to align proto-writing marks from across the world into a master index, identifying overlaps and hypothesizing migration routes. Whether this was ever completed, or whether its findings were too controversial to release, remains unknown. The hypothesis most troubling to conventional chronology is that writing did not originate in a single cradle of civilization, but instead re-emerged after a long dark age that followed the collapse of an earlier literate world. In such a model, Sumerian cuneiform was simply the most successful revival, benefiting from favourable geography and the luck of survival, while other scripts withered in obscurity. The clay tablets and etched stones hidden away in private collections, Vatican or otherwise, would be the only surviving witnesses to that earlier linguistic age. If the Vatican does indeed hold pre-Sumerian texts, even fragmentary ones, they would be a key to bridging the deepest gap in our understanding of human history, the gap between the first farmers and the first cities. Yet to open those boxes, to lay those tablets on a table under modern light, would risk overturning more than just a historical timeline. It would blur the boundary between prehistory and history, between myth and documented fact, and between the known and the forbidden. Somewhere in the dim-lit alcoves of the apostolic palace, there may be a clay shard whose symbols would align perfectly with others found half a world away, as if two halves of the same thought have been kept apart for thousands of years. Until they are joined, the clay remains silent, and in its silence lies both the mystery and the answer. In the oldest stories told beside riverbanks, There is a memory of water that came too high, too fast and too strong to escape. It is not unique to one land or one tongue. It is the flood that erased the first cities. The Sumerians wrote of it in their king list, noting how kingship descended from the heavens, only to be carried away by the flood before being restored. The Hebrews placed it in the story of Noah, the Babylonians in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and distant cultures, from the Andes to the islands of the Pacific, preserved their own variations. The details shift with each telling, but the core remains. There was a time when the world was washed clean. Mainstream archaeology interprets these tales as rooted in local disasters, river floods, rising seas, or tsunamis. Yet geological evidence points to an event, or perhaps a series of events, far more widespread around the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago. Meltwater pulses from collapsing ice sheets sent sea levels rising at a pace no human could ignore. Entire coastal plains vanished beneath the waves, and with them any settlements they held. Here the Vatican's role becomes more than a whisper. Among the less publicized holdings of its secret archives is a series of manuscripts referred to by archivists as the Chronicon Diluvii. Written in medieval Latin but claimed to be translated from much older sources, these volumes describe 9 cities laid upon the plains of the Eastern Sea and how their walls were lost to the Great Rising. The descriptions are not allegorical. They speak of measurements, of the number of days the waters took to rise, of how far inland ships could sail when the flood reached its height. The Eastern Sea is not named, but one marginal note, in a later hand, suggests it was the Persian Gulf. If true, this would place the destroyed cities in what is now a shallow seabed, an area that indeed would have been fertile land before the sea rose to cover it. Archaeological surveys have found traces of ancient riverbeds beneath the Gulf, hinting at vanished settlements along their banks. Yet no public excavation has been attempted there on the scale required to find such cities. Whether by coincidence or intent, the region has remained archaeologically silent. A strange event from the early 18th century deepens the intrigue. A Jesuit scholar travelling through Basra claimed to have seen fishermen bring up carven stones from the Gulf's shallows, stones marked with lines and spirals. He noted their similarity to patterns on Neolithic pottery found far inland. The stones, he wrote, were purchased for the benefit of the Holy See. No such stones exist in public Vatican collections today, but shipping manifests from that year list a crate-marked basalt and shale, origin undisclosed, arriving from the port of Basra. The factual anchor in this chapter is the established presence of drowned landscapes worldwide. From the Doggerland plains between Britain and Europe to the submerged Yonaguni structures off Japan's coast, there is no doubt that rising seas consumed habitable land. What remains under debate is the scale of civilization lost in the process. Historians still debate whether advanced settlements, with agriculture, organized religion, or early writing, could have existed before this inundation, or whether humanity was still in scattered small-scale communities. The hypothesis favoured by those who suspect the Vatican knows more is that some coastal cities, particularly in the Near East, were already centres of trade and knowledge before the waters rose. Their destruction would have scattered survivors inland carrying fragments of their culture, myths, architectural techniques, navigation skills, to new lands. Over time, these fragments would merge into the identities of later civilizations, including Sumer. Within the Chronicon Diluvii, there is a particularly evocative passage describing a city built of clay and timber, ringed by gardens, with canals as veins through its body. When the flood came, the gardens became the sea's bed, and the towers showed only their crowns above the foam before sinking. The phrasing is vivid, not theological, more akin to a witness account than a moral parable. Scholars who have read the text note the precision of its geographic markers, suggesting the author was preserving a location that might still be found, if one knew where to look beneath the gulf. Yet there is another stranger note in the margins of one volume. In faded ink, a later, scribe wrote, The tablets say this was not the first time. This cryptic remark implies an even deeper cycle, that floods had erased cities before, and that the one remembered here was simply the most recent in a line of cataclysm stretching back beyond memory. If such a record truly exists, it would fit into a broader pattern of flood traditions as survival memories. Some archaeologists now consider these myths to be cultural fossils, oral histories so enduring that they can persist for thousands of years. The problem is that oral histories are malleable. They shift with the teller, absorbing symbols and moral lessons. But a written record hidden in the Vatican for centuries would be different, a fixed point in the haze, a data point immune to the drift of storytelling. One cannot ignore the implications. If a civilization older than Sumer was drowned in the Gulf, and if its memory was preserved in writing, it would mean that literacy, or at least proto-literacy, existed before the traditional birth of writing. It would also mean that the Sumerians inherited more than just fertile land. They may have inherited fragments of a cultural lineage stretching back into the Ice Age. For now, the waters of the Gulf remain opaque, hiding whatever may rest beneath. And in Rome, the Chronicon Diluvii sleeps in its dark vault, a manuscript that could redraw the map of history if it were open to the light. Somewhere, perhaps, there are still fishermen who pull strange stones from the sea and wonder which shore they once belonged to. And somewhere in the Vatican, someone may already know the answer, but prefers to let the flood keep it secret. Beyond the river plains of Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates and Tigris wind like ancient silver threads, lie stretches of desert whose silence is deceiving. Beneath their sands, time has laid its own architecture, one not charted by modern maps. It is here that whispers tell of forgotten stone under desert sands, relics older than any known kingdom, older even than the earlier Sumerian bricks. In southern Egypt's eastern desert, well beyond the reach of the Nile's life-giving flood, are clusters of eroded sandstone outcrops. From a distance they appear as nothing more than weathered rock, but a few bare cuts too straight to be natural, angles too precise to be the work of wind alone. Local Bedouin have long told stories of the sleeping walls, lines of stone buried so deep in the dunes that only their highest edges are visible after rare storms. Archaeological expeditions have catalogued some of these features, but often list them as possible quarry sites or geological formations. In the 1930s, however, a French surveyor noted something unusual: a half-buried wall segment of tightly joined sandstone blocks, each over 2 meters wide without mortar, their surfaces polished. The workmanship resembled neither pharaonic masonry nor Roman stonework. The surveyor's report mentioned no associated pottery or tools, and without artifacts to date it, his find was quietly set aside. But the block's arrangement, interlocking with slight curvature, hinted at an architectural style unknown in the region's recorded history. This is where the Vatican connection begins to thread itself into the narrative. In 1937, a Jesuit geologist working under permit from Cairo visited the same site. His private field notes, later referenced in an unpublished memoir, described an entranceway sealed by a fall of stone, the interior blocked. He also mentioned finding a fragment of carved basalt nearby, inscribed with a simple relief of concentric circles intersected by straight lines. This fragment, according to his notes, was sent to Rome for preservation. Its present whereabouts are unknown. The factual basis underpinning such tales is that ancient stone structures predating Egypt's dynasties do exist in North Africa. The Nabta Playa stone circle in the Nubian desert, for instance, dates to around 5000 BCE, long before the pyramids, and shows clear astronomical alignment. But Nabta is small compared to the rumoured sleeping walls, and its function is ritual rather than urban. If larger, more complex structures exist beneath the sand, they would require both the engineering knowledge and the organised labour of a settled, sophisticated society, a society which mainstream history does not currently recognise in this region, before about 4000 BCE. The strange event that pushes this mystery further occurred in 1969, when an unusually violent sandstorm in the Libyan desert exposed the corner of what appeared to be a massive stone platform. A team from the Egyptian Antiquities Organization was dispatched, but before a full excavation could begin, the site was covered again by shifting dunes. Rumours circulated among those on the expedition that one of the workers had uncovered a carved stone depicting animals not native to the desert, creatures resembling cattle and deer, which had not lived in the region since the Sahara's Green Age thousands of years earlier. Some say the carving was photographed, others that it was quietly taken, its trail ending in a private collection. The Vatican's name is not officially attached to the incident, but one of the archaeologists involved later took a research post in Rome, where he reportedly gave closed-door lectures to select clerics on prehistoric urbanism in North Africa. Historians still debate whether these buried stones, when they appear, represent isolated monuments, ritual sites, or the remains of genuine cities. Without excavation, there is no definitive answer, only speculation grounded in surface observation and rare finds. The prevailing academic opinion remains cautious, leaning toward natural formations or small-scale settlements. Yet, the hypothesis entertained by some fringe researchers and whispered about in certain clerical circles is that these are the last bones of a civilization erased by the Sahara's transformation from lush savanna to desert. Climate records confirm that the Sahara was once green, fed by monsoon rains, supporting lakes, rivers, and abundant wildlife. This African humid period lasted until roughly 5,000 years ago, when a shift in Earth's orbit altered weather patterns and turned the region into the arid expanse we know today. If large cities existed during that fertile era, their abandonment and burial under sand would be inevitable. What would remain are exactly the kind of enigmatic, half-seen structures reported by travellers and surveyors, and possibly preserved in sketches or field reports filed away far from public access. The Vatican's role, if any, would be as custodian of such documentation. Missionaries, explorers, and scholars associated with the Church travelled widely in the Sahara during the 19th and early 20th centuries, often recording details overlooked by secular expeditions. Some of these reports, particularly those touching on origins and chronology, never entered public archives. A few resurfaced decades later, heavily edited, their original illustrations missing. Among the more persistent legends is that of a desert codex, a manuscript supposedly copied from much older scrolls found in a collapsed chamber near the Gilf Kabir plateau. This codex, according to the story, contains lists of place names, none matching known Egyptian or Berber terms, and diagrams of rectangular enclosures beside river-like lines. If authentic, it could be a map of lost settlements from the Sahara's Green Age. Allegedly, it was brought to Rome in the 1880s and stored in a climate-controlled case, seen only by a handful of archivists. Skeptics point out the lack of physical evidence, no verified photographs, no radiocarbon dates, no confirmed artifacts. But absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, especially when the potential sites lie buried beneath hundreds of meters of shifting sand. What is certain is that in satellite imagery, subtle patterns sometimes emerge in the dunes. Faint right angles, circular outlines, or linear depressions that defy purely geological explanation. The hypothesis favoured by those who tie this to the Vatican's alleged holdings is that the Church, aware of the cultural and theological implications, has chosen to treat such finds as too volatile for public release. An advanced, urbanised civilization in North Africa predating both Egypt and Sumer would force a reconsideration of the narrative in which the Fertile Crescent is humanity's sole cradle of civilization. It would also intersect with flood myths, linguistic puzzles, and the unexplained spread of certain architectural techniques, threads that, if pulled, could unravel much of the accepted historical tapestry. For now, the desert sleeps. Its sands keep the contours of ancient walls hidden from the wind, and in some quiet chamber in Rome, Perhaps there rests a fragment of basalt carved with circles and lines, a shard from a city that bloomed in a green Sahara, only to be swallowed when the rains ceased. A city that might still be there, waiting for the dunes to shift once more. Long before the priests of Sumer looked up at the night sky and carved the paths of Venus into clay, there were others who watched the heavens. They did not call themselves astronomers. That word would not exist for tens of centuries, yet they observed with a precision that seems almost alien in the archaeological record. These were the sky priests, keepers of a language written not in clay or stone, but in the alignment of stars, the rise of the moon, and the sun's measured journey across the horizon. The ruins of such sky-watching traditions still stand in scattered parts of the world. Megalithic circles, causeways, and pillars aligned to celestial events with uncanny accuracy. Most famous is Stonehenge, in far-off Britain, but it is hardly alone. In South America's Andes, at Nabta Playa in Egypt, and in the Levant, stone markers stand in silent reference to solstices and equinoxes long past. These were not mere curiosities. They were instruments, calendars, navigators, and perhaps temples, all in one. In the dry highlands of southern Anatolia, at the site of Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists have found massive T-shaped pillars, some carved with animals, others with abstract symbols. Dated to around 9,600 BCE, these structures predate not only Sumer, but the invention of pottery. Several pillars are oriented toward the point on the horizon where certain bright stars rise. The mainstream explanation is that the builders, though still hunter-gatherers, possessed an advanced understanding of the sky, likely for ritual purposes. But there is another interpretation, quieter and less welcome in academic circles, that Göbekli Tepe and other such sites were built not by isolated groups discovering astronomy anew, but by inheritors of a much older, forgotten star-watching tradition. It is here that the Vatican's shadow falls again. Among the sealed holdings in its archives are said to be manuscripts describing tabulae astrorum antiquissimae, most ancient star tables. Written in careful Latin, they purport to be translations of older records, possibly copied from scrolls or inscriptions brought from the Near East during the Crusades. What sets them apart from known medieval star charts is the position of the constellations. They are drawn as they would have appeared not in the Middle Ages nor in Sumerian times, but thousands of years earlier, when the North Star was a different star entirely. A curious detail emerges in one of these manuscripts, the repeated use of a symbol resembling an elongated S lying on its side, placed next to certain star groupings. No equivalent exists in classical Western astronomy, but similar shapes appear in petroglyphs, from the Sahara and on pottery from Neolithic Anatolia. Whether this symbol marked a deity, a season, or something else entirely, no one outside those vaults has been allowed to compare them systematically. The strange event linking this to more recent history occurred in 1902, when a Franciscan scholar in Jerusalem reported being shown a set of small bronze discs by a local antiquities dealer. Each disc bore a central hole and concentric rings of tiny punched marks, arranged in patterns resembling star maps. The dealer claimed they had been found in a cave on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, alongside fragments of cloth too fragile to touch. The scholar purchased the discs and shipped them to Rome for study. No trace of them exists in any public collection today, though a few decades later, an obscure Vatican astronomical bulletin mentioned bronze sky plates of undetermined origin, now under theological review. The factual anchor in this chapter is clear. Ancient cultures worldwide possess sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The Babylonians tracked planetary cycles with mathematical accuracy. The Mayans predicted eclipses centuries in advance. The builders of Nabta Playa aligned stones to the rising of Sirius around 4,800 BCE. What remains debated is how such knowledge developed. Historians still debate whether early societies arrived at these alignments independently or through contact with older, now vanished cultures. The hypothesis entertained by some is that there once existed a network of sacred observatories stretching across continents, linked not by empire but by shared purpose. These sites would have preserved both practical knowledge, calendars for planting and navigation, and a cosmology tying human life to the movements of the heavens. If fragments of this network's record survived into historical times, they could easily have been absorbed by religious institutions, translated, and quietly stored away. Why might the Vatican guard such knowledge? One answer lies in the delicate intersection between cosmology and theology. If these star tables proved that advanced astronomical observation existed long before the accepted dawn of civilization, they would challenge not only historical timelines, but also certain theological narratives about the origins of human knowledge. For centuries, the Church has been both a patron of astronomy and a gatekeeper of ancient texts, sometimes encouraging new discoveries, sometimes sheltering them from public view. In whispered academic conversations, there is mention of a Codex Stellarium, a bound collection of parchment leaves allegedly compiled in the 16th century from much older fragments. Within it, star charts are drawn on blackened vellum with gold and silver ink, showing the positions of constellations as they appeared over 14,000 years ago. Whether these charts were reconstructed mathematically or copied from a lost source is unknown. The codex has never been displayed, yet it is said to rest in the same climate-controlled vault as certain pre-Columbian maps, a sign that the Vatican considers it both precious and potentially disruptive. Some scholars argue that, if genuine, these documents could help us understand why certain ancient monuments across the world share similar celestial alignments. Others warn that without context, without knowing who made them and why, they could lead to more speculation than clarity. The truth, as always, remains locked behind those doors of iron and shadow. But there is one enduring thought. The language of the sky priests may still be all around us, hidden in the orientation of old temples, the spacing of stones, and the rituals that greet the dawn. If the Vatican holds the final key to decoding it, then somewhere in those guarded rooms is a chart not of where we are, but of where we once stood, beneath a different pole star, when the first great cities had yet to rise. Long before the compass was invented, before the first ink maps were drawn on papyrus, there were those who charted the shape of the world with a precision we cannot fully explain. These were the map makers of the First Age, people who lived in a time when coastlines looked nothing like they do today, when vast tracts of land now drowned under oceans were still green and inhabited. Their work, if it truly existed, has all but vanished. Yet faint echoes of it survive in artifacts and legends, and in whispers about certain documents resting deep in the Vatican's hidden collections. Among the most puzzling pieces of evidence in the public domain is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. It is famous not for its age, medieval maps are plentiful, but for what it appears to show: the western coasts of Africa and South America, and, controversially, the northern coastline of Antarctica free of ice. Geologists agree that Antarctica has been buried under ice for thousands of years, so either the map is wrong, or it was based on older sources from a time when the continent's coast was ice-free. The admiral himself claimed to have compiled it from 20 charts and mappae mundi from ancient sources, some of them drawn in the time of Alexander the Great. It is here that the Vatican enters the narrative through a series of tantalizing coincidences. In private correspondence between 16th century scholars, there are references to maps from the old libraries of the East being sent to Rome for safekeeping. One letter, preserved in a minor bishop's personal papers, describes a chart of southern lands, so accurate that it may have been drawn before the sea swallowed its present shores. The letter's recipient was a Vatican cartographer tasked with updating the Church's world maps. None of these southern charts are known to exist today, at least not outside restricted collections. A strange event in the 19th century deepens the intrigue. In 1856, A Jesuit missionary returning from South America claimed to have obtained a fragment of a skin map from an indigenous elder in the Andes. The elder insisted it was a copy of a far older chart passed down through generations. The fragment, drawn in red and black ink, depicted a chain of islands off a coastline that no longer matches modern geography, as though drawn before sea levels rose after the last ice age. The Jesuit sent it to Rome. The shipping record survives, but the fragment's fate is unknown. There is a factual anchor here. Scholars acknowledge that ancient peoples had far greater navigational abilities than once believed. The Polynesians sailed across thousands of kilometres of open ocean with only the stars and waves as guides. The Phoenicians may have circumnavigated Africa. The Minoans, Egyptians, and early Mesopotamians engaged in long-distance trade that required at least rudimentary mapping. Yet none of these known civilizations operated in the Ice Age, when the world's coastlines were radically different. Historians still debate whether supposed anomalous maps like the Piri Reis truly depict ancient knowledge, or are the result of guesswork, distortions, and imaginative interpolation by later mapmakers. The consensus leans toward caution. Most anomalies can be explained by copying errors or misinterpretations of source materials. But the hypothesis favoured by some is that a handful of maps were indeed based on remnants of a much older, possibly global, cartographic tradition. The Vatican's alleged involvement is tied to its long history of collecting not only religious texts, but also works of geography. The Church sponsored expeditions, trained cartographers, and acted as a repository for documents considered politically or theologically sensitive. If the Vatican holds maps that predate known civilizations, it would explain the persistence of rumours about world charts in its vaults. These would not necessarily be complete maps as we know them today, but fragments, coastal outlines, or navigational diagrams copied and recopied over millennia. One internal story, never confirmed, but recounted by a retired archivist to a colleague decades later, concerns a large vellum sheet known as the Tabula Prima. Allegedly, it depicts an unbroken coastline stretching from the western bulge of Africa down around a great southern continent, then curving into the Pacific in a way no modern map matches. The landmasses are drawn with remarkable proportion, yet there are no political borders or place names, only symbols, triangles that might indicate mountains, spirals that could mark harbours, and dotted lines arcing across open ocean. The archivist claimed it was kept in a long, narrow case, brought out only when certain senior scholars requested to see it. The strange, off-topic element in this web of stories comes from the archives of the Vatican Observatory. Among its earliest star charts are several sheets with faint outlines of coastlines drawn in the margins, coastlines that match no known projection of Earth's continents. The outlines were never labelled and do not correspond to any recognised map from the period. Whether they were idle doodles, speculative geography, or copied from a lost source, no one can say. Why hide such maps? One reason might be the theological implications. If it could be proven that humans mapped the world, or parts of it, tens of thousands of years ago, it would imply the existence of civilizations advanced enough to travel and survey across oceans long before Sumer or Egypt. This would directly challenge the linear progression model of history that has been taught for centuries. Another reason might be more practical. Releasing such maps could trigger speculative treasure hunts or uncontrolled excavations in fragile sites. The hypothesis linking it all together is that, during the Ice Age or shortly thereafter, a seafaring culture, or network of cultures, charted parts of the world now lost to rising seas. After their disappearance, their charts, or copies of them, survived in fragments, passed from hand to hand, incorporated into the maps of later civilizations. Over millennia, these fragments ended up in various repositories, including the Vatican's deep vaults, where they remain, preserved but silent. In those vaults, perhaps there is a rolled parchment whose ink has faded to brown, its lines tracing a coastline now buried beneath hundreds of meters of ice. To see it would be to glimpse not only geography, but a history that has slipped through our fingers, the outline of a world we no longer inhabit, drawn by hands we no longer remember. In the quiet order of the archaeological record, human remains are expected to appear where they belong, layered neatly in the strata that match their supposed era. But sometimes the Earth refuses to cooperate. There are bones in the wrong layer, scattered across the world, that refuse to fit the accepted chronology. Some are older than they should be, others too modern for the depth in which they are found. In each case, the anomalies are explained away. Intrusive burials, geological disturbances, mislabeling in old digs, yet a small number remains stubbornly unexplained. In the 1920s, miners in a South African gold reef uncovered a human skull fragment embedded in rock strata over 2 million years old. The piece was sent to several institutions, examined, then declared an erroneous association, the result of later intrusion into older layers. But those who saw the original context swore the bone was encased in undisturbed material. The fossil disappeared from public view soon after, reportedly sent to a European research institute. Some suspect that the institute was a church-affiliated institution, with close ties to the Vatican's own anthropological collection. A stranger case emerged in 1959 in Italy's Apuan Alps. Quarry workers breaking limestone for cement found a human femur alongside the fossilised remains of Pleistocene fauna, giant deer and extinct bovids, in a sealed fissure. The geological dating of the fissure placed its closure at least 100,000 years ago, far earlier than the accepted arrival of anatomically modern humans in the region. The femur was removed, studied briefly, and then quietly archived. A single handwritten note survives in a regional museum stating simply, "Transferred to Rome for ecclesiastical study." The factual anchor here is that out of place remains are documented in scientific literature, though almost always with conventional explanations. In North America, for instance, early reports claimed human remains in deposits tens of thousands of years old, but later review often found the layers disturbed. Historians still debate whether a few surviving anomalies are genuine or the product of incomplete data. One of the most persistent Vatican-connected rumours involves a collection known informally among a small circle of clerics as the bones of the before. This is said to be a set of human skeletal remains kept in a sealed cabinet in the lower levels of the Apostolic Palace. Unlike saints' relics, these bones are not venerated or displayed. They are studied, measured, and locked away again. Allegedly, their geological provenance, recorded in Latin on accompanying parchment tags, places them in layers far too old for Homo sapiens according to current models. A particularly strange event tied to this lore occurred in the early 1970s, when an Italian spelunking team exploring a deep karst system in Sardinia discovered a chamber sealed by calcite formations. Inside were scattered human bones, along with worked stone tools, in association with the remains of a fauna known to have gone extinct over 50,000 years ago. The cave was sealed again under the supervision of local authorities, but within a month, the team's leader received a formal request from a Vatican cultural office to assist in the proper recording and preservation of any anthropological materials. No public excavation followed, and access to the site was later restricted. The hypothesis among some researchers is that such anomalous finds, if genuine, would destabilize the current narrative of human dispersal and evolution. The accepted model, Homo sapiens emerging in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago and dispersing in waves, would be complicated by evidence of anatomically modern humans living in distant parts of the world far earlier than expected. For the Vatican, which historically engaged deeply in debates about human origins, such evidence would demand careful consideration before public release. An off-topic but related mystery lies in the archives of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. In the late 19th century, a Jesuit naturalist published a series of sketches of skeletal remains claiming they were from ancient peoples of unknown antiquity found during missionary expeditions in Asia. The publication was quickly withdrawn, the plates destroyed, but surviving copies show skulls with unusual proportions, broader crania and flatter faces, unlike any known population. Whether these were misinterpretations, deliberate exaggerations, or genuine representations of lost lineages is impossible to confirm. Historians still debate whether such bone anomalies represent genuine deep antiquity, misidentified species, or even frauds from less rigorous periods of archaeology. But the persistence of the Vatican's alleged involvement suggests a different possibility, that the Church has, over centuries, gathered physical evidence of human presence far older than accepted history allows, holding it in reserve until, or unless, the world is ready to reconcile it with established science. In the cool, dry chambers beneath St. Peter's, where light falls in thin, golden shafts through dust-laden air, there may be a drawer lined in red velvet. Inside, tagged in Latin, could rest a fragment of jaw or a single metacarpal bone, its mineralized surface telling a story of a human, or human-like, life lived tens of thousands of years before the first known city was built. It is a story that, for now, remains locked away in silence. Before Uruk's ziggurats rose above the Mesopotamian plain, before the first bricks were baked in the sun, there were the builders without a name. Their works still exist, not in the form of palaces or temples whose inscriptions declare their creators, but in the silent, weathered bones of walls and fortresses that stand without a written claim to their origin. Their craftsmanship is so advanced that even modern engineers pause to consider the precision, yet no surviving record tells us who they were. In the highlands of Peru, cyclopean walls rise from the earth in seamless polygonal fits, each stone so perfectly shaped that even a blade of grass cannot slip between them. In Greece, the so-called Mycenaean walls at Tiryns and Mycenae are built of massive blocks whose origins remain debated. And across the Mediterranean, in places like Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and the fortresses of the Nuragic culture in Sardinia, the same uncanny mastery appears. Different continents, similar techniques. In North Africa, scattered amid the dunes of Algeria and Libya, there are low, weathered ramparts made of enormous stone blocks, some with beveled edges that match no known historical period in the region. Most are attributed to local tribes or early Berber kingdoms, yet carbon dating of organic material trapped between the stones often returns results far older than those cultures' known presence. The factual anchor here is that advanced stone cutting and polygonal masonry techniques did exist in the ancient world, but in most places they appear suddenly, without a clear developmental lineage. Historians still debate whether these techniques arose independently in different parts of the world or spread through a shared, now lost cultural network. The lack of transitional phases, simpler examples that evolve into complex forms, remains an unresolved puzzle. It is within this gap that the Vatican's rumoured holdings cast their long shadow. Among the inventory ledgers of the Archivum Secretum are a handful of entries in Latin referring to fragmenta murorum prisco more fabricatorum, fragments of walls constructed in an ancient manner. These entries, though sparse in detail, note the provenance as Mediterranean islands and beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The implication is that Vatican agents or affiliates may have acquired pieces of ancient masonry, either for study or as relics of lost engineering traditions. A strange event occurred in 1894 when a papal-sponsored archaeological mission to the island of Malta reported discovering a buried chamber beneath the Hagar Kim temples. Inside, they claimed, was a section of wall built from stone blocks unlike the temple's own architecture, larger, smoother, and laid without mortar. No official excavation record exists, and within a year the chamber was sealed again due to instability. Whispers among those involved suggest that a carved lintel stone was removed from the site and shipped to Rome, where it was stored in a climate-controlled case within the Vatican's anthropological collection. The hypothesis favoured by some researchers is that these massive masonry traditions, from the Andes to the Mediterranean, are not isolated inventions, but the fading echoes of a shared architectural knowledge passed down from a pre-Sumerian civilization. Such knowledge would have included not only the shaping of immense stones, but also techniques for transporting and fitting them so precisely that they have survived earthquakes and centuries of weathering. An off-topic but curious connection emerges from an unpublished manuscript held in the Vatican Library, attributed to a 16th century Spanish chronicler. In it he describes visiting a fortress in the New World, whose walls match the old stones of Iberia in form and precision. The chronicler speculates that these builders, separated by oceans, must have shared a parent craft. The manuscript was never printed, and the sole surviving copy remains in restricted access. Historians still debate the origins of polygonal masonry. Some suggest it arose from practical needs in seismic zones, where interlocking stones resist collapse better than straight courses. Others believe it reflects a ritual or symbolic meaning, with each unique stone representing a cosmic order. But the absence of written plans, tools, or experimental stages leaves open the possibility that the skill was inherited rather than invented. If the Vatican does indeed preserve fragments, sketches, or even surviving blueprints of these construction methods, they would represent a rare and irreplaceable link to a period of human history that straddles the border between legend and fact. The decision to keep them hidden could be as simple as a lack of context, artifacts without a clear narrative, or as deliberate as a choice to avoid fueling speculative theories about vanished global civilizations. Somewhere in the deep vaults, perhaps, rests a smooth, beveled stone no larger than a man's hand. To most eyes it would be just a rock, but under close examination its cut and angle would match, in perfect miniature, the colossal walls standing in Peru or the highlands of Greece, a mute witness to a craft whose name, and the people who practiced it, have long since been lost to the wind. Across the known timeline of human history, metallurgy appears in a predictable sequence: copper first, then bronze, and finally iron, each marking a leap forward in technology and social complexity. Yet there are scattered reports, most dismissed or quietly filed away, of metals and alloys that should not exist in the eras from which they supposedly come. This is the puzzle of the metal that shouldn't exist, and in certain corners of scholarly rumour, it is whispered that the Vatican has preserved some of the most perplexing examples. The modern science of archaeometallurgy has confirmed that the oldest known smelting of copper occurred in the Balkans around 5000 BCE, and the earliest true bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, emerged in Mesopotamia a millennium later. But what if there are artifacts, predating both, whose composition suggests not only smelting but complex alloying processes? One of the most famous public anomalies is the Delhi iron pillar in India, dating to around 400 CE, which resists corrosion far better than modern steel due to its high phosphorus content and unique forging method. That alone is not enough to rewrite history, but there are less publicised finds that strain the sequence further. In the 1940s, miners in Bolivia unearthed a small hammer-like object encased in a solid nodule of sandstone. Initial tests suggested the metal head was a high-purity iron alloy, supposedly impossible to produce in the prehistoric period. Mainstream archaeology dismissed it as a modern intrusion into ancient strata, but the object's whereabouts today are unclear. Some accounts claim it was sent to Europe for further study under the auspices of a Catholic institution. The Vatican connection surfaces more clearly in the 19th century, when a missionary in Anatolia reportedly discovered a small flat ingot of golden bronze metal among ruins tentatively dated to the Neolithic period. The ingot bore a repeating pattern of stamped symbols unlike known scripts. Instead of being submitted to local authorities, it was shipped directly to Rome as part of the missionaries' cultural gifts to the Curia. In Vatican inventory ledgers, a single vague line survives: Aeneas lamina vetustissima, reginem incertum, a very ancient bronze plate, origin uncertain. A strange and off-topic case, but one often tied to these rumours, is that of the so-called meteoric blades found in several elite burials across the ancient world. The most famous is the dagger from Tutankhamun's tomb, forged from meteoritic iron over 1,000 years before the Iron Age began in Egypt. The use of meteoric iron is not inherently mysterious. Its high nickel content made it workable without smelting, but there are scattered reports of meteoric alloys combined with other metals, a feat requiring intentional melting and mixing at temperatures supposedly beyond the reach of Bronze Age furnaces. One such blade, described in an unpublished paper by a 1920s Jesuit archaeologist, was said to have been recovered from a collapsed tomb in the Caucasus region and brought to Rome for preservation. The factual anchor here is that metallurgy often appears earlier in small, isolated cases than in the mainstream archaeological record, as new finds push back the first dates for smelting in various regions. Historians still debate whether isolated advanced artifacts represent independent invention, accidental creation, or contact between cultures much earlier than believed. The hypothesis most tantalizing to fringe scholars is that there existed, long before Sumer, a metallurgical tradition capable of producing alloys with properties we're only beginning to replicate. Such a tradition could have been the closely guarded craft of a small class of artisans, its techniques lost in waves of societal collapse, leaving behind only scattered examples. If the Vatican has acquired some of these, through missionary work, private purchase, or donation, they may represent the only surviving samples of an entire forgotten science. One particularly evocative account comes from an Italian metallurgist who, in the 1960s, claimed to have been invited to examine a small collection of ancient metals from undisclosed locations within the Vatican. He described a fist-sized ingot with a metallic luster unlike gold or copper, heavier than lead yet untarnished despite obvious antiquity. Its surface bore faint intersecting lines as though it had been cast in a mould carved with geometric patterns. He took no samples, permission was not granted, but he left convinced that the alloy was neither accidental nor known to modern metallurgy. Why would such finds be withheld from public research? One explanation could be the uncertainty of their context. Without secure archaeological provenance, their significance would be easily challenged. Another is the theological implication. Artifacts showing complex metallurgy in a period when humans are thought to have been primitive could destabilize the conventional chronology that underpins much of historical teaching. Somewhere in a Vatican vault, perhaps there lies a simple object, a cup, a blade, or a block, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. To the untrained eye it might seem ordinary, but to a metallurgist a single test could reveal that it should not exist at all in the era from which it came. A reminder that technology is not a one-way road from ignorance to mastery, but a fragile inheritance that can be gained, lost, and hidden away for millennia. Long before the Library of Alexandria gathered scrolls from across the known world, before its vast holdings burned in the wars of empires, there may have been another repository of knowledge, one older, more complete, and long since vanished. The idea of a great library before Alexandria seems at first like wishful imagination. But certain traditions, half remembered in ancient sources, suggest that there once existed a central archive of human knowledge in a time when most of the world's cities had yet to be built. Greek historians occasionally hinted at the possibility. Diodorus Siculus wrote of Egyptian priests who claimed their own archives went back tens of thousands of years, recording the reigns of divine and mortal kings alike. Plato, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, mentioned Egyptian records far older than Greece's oldest myths, supposedly preserved in the temples of Sais. Such stories are usually framed as exaggerations, but if even part of them is true, they point to a tradition of record-keeping that stretches far beyond the birth of Sumer. The factual anchor here is that ancient civilizations did maintain archives, clay tablet libraries in Mesopotamia, temple scroll rooms in Egypt, and storerooms of oracle bones in China. But what is debated is the true age of these traditions. Historians still debate whether systematic record-keeping emerged independently in each early civilization, or if it was inherited in fragments from an earlier, unknown source. The Vatican's shadow enters this story through its own centuries-long role as an accumulator of knowledge. The Church has, since its earliest centuries, received manuscripts and relics from distant lands, sometimes as gifts, sometimes as spoils, sometimes as private acquisitions by missionaries. In the Archivum Secretum there are rumoured to be several bound codices described in inventories as translationes ex libris antiquis ante Alexandrinum incendium, translations from ancient books before the burning of Alexandria. The wording is tantalizingly vague, offering no details about what these books contained, nor how they were obtained. A strange event from the late 18th century adds weight to these whispers. In 1789, a Jesuit scholar in Malta claimed to have been entrusted with several sealed chests, recovered from a collapsed chamber beneath an old fortress. The chests contained rolls of papyrus so brittle they could not be unrolled without crumbling. The scholar reported that some bore scripts resembling early hieratic Egyptian, others were in unknown characters. Lacking the means to preserve them on the island, he sent the chests to Rome for special care. There is no public record of their arrival, but 2 years later, Vatican acquisition logs include an entry for volumina papyri vetustissima ex insulis Mediterraneus, very ancient papyrus volumes from Mediterranean islands. The hypothesis among certain researchers is that at least part of the pre-Alexandrian library's contents survived, not in one place, but dispersed after the destruction of the original. If a fragmentary collection made its way into ecclesiastical hands centuries or millennia later, it could explain the persistence of ancient knowledge in later religious and philosophical traditions. An off-topic but curious parallel exists in the medieval Book of Soiga, a treatise on magic and mathematics owned by John Dee in the 16th century. For centuries the book was thought lost, until 2 copies were found in the British Library and the Bodleian Library. Some Vatican scholars privately noted similarities between its content and certain diagrams held in restricted archives, suggesting that such esoteric survivals sometimes mirror older hidden sources. Why would the Vatican guard possible fragments of an older great library? Partly because of their fragility. Ancient papyrus and vellum can survive only under the most controlled conditions. But there may also be theological concerns. A corpus of texts older than the traditional timeline of history, possibly containing myths, histories, or sciences at odds with later scripture, could provoke controversy or be misunderstood without context. In the quiet, climate-controlled depths beneath Vatican City, there may rest a roll of papyrus whose fibres still hold the ink of an unknown scribe, perhaps writing in a language no one alive can read. The words could speak of cities no longer on any map, of rulers whose names never entered the annals of recorded history, of star charts drawn before the constellations had their present shapes. Such a document would not simply predate the Library of Alexandria, it would rewrite the very foundation of our understanding of how human memory has been preserved. Across the deep reaches of recorded myth, there are stories of things falling from the sky, not gentle rain or snow, but fire, stone, and ruin. In some accounts, these events are divine punishments. In others, they are mere omens. Yet modern science has confirmed that catastrophic meteor impacts have reshaped Earth more than once in human prehistory, and sometimes during periods close enough to leave cultural scars. Among the oldest of these scars, preserved in both oral traditions and geological layers, are the so-called Starfall Chronicles, accounts of great disasters written in the language of both myth and history. In the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish, the heavens are not just a stage for gods but an arena for violent upheavals. In ancient Chinese annals, fire stars blaze across the sky before dynastic collapses. And among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, there are songlines describing the day the sun fell twice, a poetic but remarkably accurate depiction of a meteor's arrival and the secondary explosions it caused. These traditions often preserve details, colour, sound, even sequence, that match what modern witnesses have reported in recent impact events. The factual anchor here is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a theory that around 12,800 years ago fragments of a large comet struck or exploded over multiple regions of Earth, triggering rapid climate cooling, megafaunal extinctions, and perhaps societal collapse among early human cultures. While the hypothesis remains controversial, geological evidence from North America, Greenland, and the Middle East includes microscopic spherules, nanodiamonds, and layers of soot consistent with massive firestorms. Historians still debate whether the event was global in scale or a series of regional catastrophes. Where, then, does the Vatican enter this story? Through a set of manuscripts known in restricted catalogues as the Liber Celestis Ruinae, the Book of the Heavenly Ruin. Bound in leather so dark it appears almost black, its pages are filled with Latin translations of much older texts, some of which are said to be fragments from Near Eastern and Mediterranean sources. The Liber reportedly describes a rain of fire from the north and waters that rose to meet the falling stars, language suggestive of an impact followed by flood events. What makes it more compelling, if the accounts are genuine, is the mention of cities laid down in rings and fields of shining stone that were melted as wax in the aftermath. A strange event in the late 19th century brought the Liber briefly into academic conversation. A Jesuit astronomer lecturing in Paris, speaking off record to colleagues, hinted that the Vatican possessed a text describing a great burning in the days before the oldest empires. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, saying only that the source was not yet for public eyes. Within months, he was reassigned to South America, and no further mention of the document appeared in his published work. The off-topic but related curiosity here is the existence of ancient impact craters whose dating overlaps with formative periods in human culture. The Wabar crater in Saudi Arabia, for example, shows signs of a meteorite strike in the last few thousand years, yet local Bedouin oral tradition describes it as the place where the star fell and the sands turned to glass. Similar desert glass fields in Egypt's Libyan desert, used by ancient artisans for jewellery, are now believed to have formed in intense heat from atmospheric explosions. The hypothesis favoured by some is that the Vatican's Liber Celestis Ruinae may preserve accounts from literate cultures, perhaps coastal or riverine, that were obliterated by one of these events. Such a record could be the only surviving first-hand testimony of a catastrophe predating even the earliest known written civilizations. The mention of cities in rings, in particular, has drawn comparisons to Plato's description of Atlantis, though whether the similarity is coincidence or common mythic inheritance is unknowable without seeing the original text. Historians still debate whether ancient accounts of fire from the sky are literal or symbolic. The difficulty lies in the fact that impacts, while rare, are inevitable over geological timescales, and even a single regional event can alter climate, food sources, and political stability. Yet without clear physical correlation to specific stories, the line between history and allegory blurs. Why would the Vatican preserve such a document without releasing it? The answer may be simple. Without corroborating evidence, it would be seen as just another apocalyptic myth. Or perhaps it contains descriptions that, if confirmed, would force a reconsideration of human vulnerability to such events, and the idea that whole civilizations could vanish in a single day, their only memorial a half-forgotten manuscript in a locked vault. In the controlled stillness beneath Vatican City, it is easy to imagine a table lit by a single lamp, the Liber Celestis Ruinae open to a page where ink drawings depict a black sky raining streaks of white fire over a coastline whose shape no longer exists. The scribe who copied it centuries ago may not have understood what he was preserving, only that it was important. And perhaps, somewhere in the real world, a crater or a glass-strewn plain still waits to be matched to those ancient chilling words. In the deep cold of Earth's polar regions, the ice has a memory. It holds, layer by layer, the dust of ancient deserts, the ash of forgotten volcanoes, and the faint chemical traces of climates long gone. Beneath the glaciers, entire landscapes sleep in darkness, their rivers frozen in place, their mountains hidden under miles of compressed snow. Modern science has only begun to peer into these hidden realms with radar and seismic imaging. But in the realm of speculation, and in whispers tied to the Vatican's most inaccessible vaults, there exists a far stranger suggestion that beneath these icebound worlds lie the remnants of civilizations older than any in recorded history. The idea of a kingdom beneath the glaciers has always carried a mythic weight. In Norse sagas, there are lands beyond the ice, ruled by ancient powers. In Tibetan tradition, there is Shambhala, a hidden realm of enlightenment, often placed beyond great mountains or within lands of eternal frost. Even the Greeks told of Hyperborea, a blessed place far to the north, warmed by a sun that never set. While historians treat such accounts as allegory or cultural metaphor, some researchers note that they could be distorted memories of real places, seen or remembered before the last ice age swallowed them. The factual anchor here comes from recent discoveries in Greenland and Antarctica. In Greenland, radar mapping has revealed buried mountain ranges, vast lakes sealed under ice for millions of years, and signs of ancient river systems. In Antarctica, scientists have identified subglacial structures like Lake Vostok, an enormous body of liquid water trapped under more than 3 kilometers of ice. And while no definitive human artifacts have been found there, the preserved landscapes could, in theory, hide traces of earlier life or even habitation. Historians still debate whether human beings could have reached and settled such regions before the onset of the current glacial coverage. The Vatican's name enters this narrative through a series of cryptic entries in its classified geographical holdings. In a mid-17th century inventory, there is mention of Tabula Septentrionalis Antiquissima, the most ancient northern map, said to depict lands beyond the Great Ice, with rivers and habitations. The source of this map is unclear, though a marginal note states it was copied from older originals in a monastery that no longer exists. No image of the map has ever been made public. A strange event in the early 20th century adds another layer to the mystery. In 1929, during the same year that the Piri Reis map was rediscovered in Istanbul, a Catholic missionary stationed in southern Argentina reportedly came into possession of a tattered scroll drawn on animal skin. The scroll depicted the southern tip of South America, but extending far beyond it was a detailed landmass, complete with mountain ranges, rivers, and what appeared to be clusters of structures. According to the missionary's correspondence, the local indigenous informants claimed the map was from the ancestors who saw the land before the ice. The scroll was sent to Rome for preservation. Its fate is unknown, but several years later, Vatican acquisition logs list an Antiqua Mappa Australis, an ancient southern map. Off-topic but noteworthy is the story of the Orontius Phineas map of 1531, held today in the Library of Congress, which appears to depict Antarctica without its ice sheet. While mainstream historians attribute its accuracy to a mix of guesswork and compilation from earlier coastal surveys, some suggest it hints at older, more accurate sources. If such sources existed, fragments of them could be among the Vatican's guarded cartographic treasures. The hypothesis entertained by more adventurous researchers is that, during warmer periods in Earth's climate history, parts of Greenland and Antarctica were ice-free and habitable. Seafaring cultures, perhaps from now submerged coastlines elsewhere, could have explored and mapped these lands. If they settled there, their remains are now locked beneath ice older than the pyramids. A map or written record from that time, preserved through successive copies, would be the only surviving witness. Historians still debate whether the legends of lands beyond the ice are purely symbolic or faint echoes of Ice Age exploration. The lack of physical artifacts fuels skepticism, but the possibility of preserved sites under miles of ice remains scientifically plausible, as long as no catastrophic glacial movement destroyed them. Why would the Vatican conceal such materials? The reasoning could be geopolitical as much as theological. Antarctica is bound by international treaties. Any confirmed evidence of ancient human settlement could trigger fierce disputes over heritage, access, and ownership. Releasing such information without preparation might invite a rush of unregulated exploration to one of the planet's most fragile environments. In the stillness beneath St. Peter's, it is not hard to imagine a flat, leather-bound folio resting on a shelf. Inside, drawn in brown ink, could be a coastline lined with symbols denoting cities, rivers winding inward toward a central plateau, and notes in an archaic script no one alive can fluently read. The edges of the folio would be brittle, the parchment smelling faintly of salt and age, as though it had once travelled far over open seas. If real, such a chart would not only expand the boundaries of human history, it would place them far beneath the glaciers in a kingdom the modern world has yet to see. Through the genealogies of kings and the chronicles of dynasties, history records bloodlines like rivers, branching, merging, ending. Yet there are quieter streams, older and less visible, that carry the inheritance of peoples whose names have faded. Among the most persistent whispers in both folklore and speculative history is the idea that some human lineages have survived from a time long before the rise of the Sumerians, direct descendants of a forgotten dawn age. The notion of bloodlines from the forgotten dawn is not simply the invention of modern conspiracy theorists. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs claimed descent from gods who ruled in the primeval time. Sumerian king lists speak of rulers who reigned for impossibly long spans before the flood swept over. In the Andes, Inca nobility traced their ancestry to the Viracochas, pale-skinned, bearded figures said to have emerged from the sea carrying knowledge of agriculture and building. Whether these tales are metaphor, propaganda, or distorted memory remains debated. The factual anchor here is that genetic studies have revealed lineages within human populations that diverged far earlier than the spread of agriculture. Isolated groups from the Khoisan of southern Africa to the Eta of the Philippines preserve markers of deep human ancestry. Historians still debate whether certain rare haplogroups in Eurasia might represent survival from very ancient migrations, ones that do not fit neatly into the conventional model of human expansion. The Vatican's rumoured connection to this subject lies not in public anthropological research, but in private genealogical archives. For centuries, the Church kept detailed family records, not only for noble houses but also for entire regions under its influence. Buried within these, some say, are lines that can be traced far beyond the medieval or classical world, through oral histories transcribed by missionaries from peoples on the margins of empires. In the Archivum Secretum, there are said to be scrolls catalogued as Series Sanguinis Antiquissimae, most ancient bloodlines, containing diagrams where names are written in scripts no longer in use, perhaps copied from older originals now lost. A strange event in the early 1600s hints at how such records might have been gathered. A Jesuit envoy in the Caucasus wrote to Rome describing a local chieftain who claimed descent from the people before the towers. He presented the envoy with a family tree inked on vellum, its upper branches filled not with personal names but with glyph-like symbols, each enclosed in a circle. The envoy sent the document to the Vatican, along with notes comparing the symbols to those found on carved stones in the region. No public trace of the vellum remains, though in the 19th century a Vatican scholar published a cryptic remark about lineages marked by signs, not words. An off-topic but related curiosity comes from certain illuminated manuscripts in the Vatican Library that contain marginal portraits of figures wearing clothing far older than the text period. In some cases, the captions identify them as ancestors of the true kings, or fathers of the world's builders. Whether these images were artistic fantasy or based on remembered tradition is unknown, but their inclusion suggests a fascination with the idea of primordial ancestry. The hypothesis held by some independent researchers is that fragments of genealogical memory, preserved through symbols, oral history, and selective record-keeping, point to the survival of bloodlines from a sophisticated pre-Sumerian culture. If such a culture fell suddenly, its survivors might have been absorbed into younger societies, their heritage recorded in ways only their descendants understood. Over millennia, these records could easily pass into the custody of religious institutions, where they would be preserved for reasons of both history and prestige. Historians still debate whether ancient claims of divine or otherworldly descent have any basis in reality. Most agree they served political ends, legitimizing rulers by linking them to mythic ancestors. Yet genetic evidence sometimes produces anomalies, markers in elite burials that do not match the surrounding population, or rare haplogroups turning up in distant and unexpected places. Without careful context, such data can be misleading. But in the hands of an institution with centuries of genealogical material, patterns could emerge that no modern study has yet attempted. Why might the Vatican conceal such findings? The answer could lie in the implications. Evidence of continuous human lines stretching back to the so-called prehistoric world could challenge not only historical timelines, but also theological interpretations of humanity's origins. It might also reframe the histories of entire regions, granting ancient legitimacy to peoples or claims now forgotten or politically sensitive. Somewhere in a climate-controlled drawer, perhaps there rests a scroll written in a fading ink, its lines flowing like rivers across a page, branching into names that end in unfamiliar symbols. A key to tracing an unbroken human thread from the shadowed dawn of civilization to the present, a thread that has passed through empires, through faiths, through silence, and still exists in living descendants who do not know the weight of the blood they carry. Long before the kings of Sumer recorded their conquests in baked clay, and before the first armies marched across the Fertile Crescent, there are whispers of an older conflict, a war fought between cities whose names have never been read aloud in modern times. In the absence of written records, the war of the first cities survives as fragments, stories half buried in later myth, strange archaeological finds in regions with no known history of urbanization, and, according to persistent rumours, a small number of sealed Vatican manuscripts whose accounts suggest the first cities may have fallen not to the slow erosion of time, but to fire and deliberate destruction. The factual anchor comes from sites scattered across the Near East and South Asia. In northern Syria, the ruins of Tel Brak reveal a settlement that flourished nearly 6,000 years ago, its population larger than most contemporary towns in Mesopotamia. Excavations show sudden layers of burning, followed by centuries of abandonment. In Pakistan's Indus Valley, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, though later than Sumer, show eerily similar patterns of collapse, with abandoned streets and signs of disruption to trade and civic life. Historians still debate whether such destructions were caused by invasion, internal unrest, or environmental shifts. The Vatican's possible connection surfaces in an obscure Latin index from the late 17th century, listing a work titled De Bello Antiquissimo Urbium, on the most ancient war of cities. The index entry offers no author's name, only a note that it is a translation from Eastern fragments of unknown age. Those fragments, according to marginal annotations, were written on thin sheets of beaten copper, engraved with both pictorial and abstract symbols. Their provenance is given simply as ex oriente longinquo, from the Far East, a term which, in early modern Latin, could refer to anything from Mesopotamia to the Indus. A strange event in the early 1900s deepens the mystery. An Italian archaeologist working in southeastern Iran sent a sealed crate to Rome, accompanied by a letter describing tablets of copper, their faces bearing signs of walls, towers, and men in conflict, unlike any script I have known. Shortly thereafter, the archaeologist died of illness before publishing his findings. The crate was logged as received in Vatican shipping records, but there is no further public trace. The hypothesis entertained by some researchers is that these copper plates, if genuine, may depict a conflict between proto-urban centres predating both Sumer and Egypt. The existence of large, organised cities at such an early stage would imply that civilization arose in multiple places at once, rather than radiating from a single cradle. And if these cities fought wars, it would suggest a political complexity far earlier than expected. Off-topic but intriguing are certain petroglyphs in the Caucasus and Central Asia that show fortifications, siege devices, and lines of warriors with shields and spears. These carvings are difficult to date precisely, but some appear to predate the Bronze Age. While such scenes could depict myth or ceremony, their detail, including weaponry and defensive walls, hints at familiarity with large-scale conflict. Historians still debate whether warfare is as old as civilization itself, or whether it arose later as a consequence of resource competition in densely populated regions. Some anthropologists argue that early cities may have coexisted peacefully for long periods, bound by trade and ritual ties. Others suggest that the very act of building walls implies the expectation of attack. Why would the Vatican choose to keep such records from public view? One possibility is that the destruction of early cities, if connected to human aggression rather than natural disaster, could complicate theological or moral narratives about the nature of humanity's beginnings. Another is that the geographic implications, revealing the locations of these earliest urban centres, could spark contested claims, illicit excavations, or political disputes. If the copper plates truly exist, they may still lie in a drawer somewhere deep beneath the apostolic palace, wrapped in cloth to keep the metal from tarnishing. On their surfaces, perhaps, are the stylized outlines of towers and ramparts, the sweep of walls, and the silhouettes of warriors from an age without a name. A war fought so long ago that only the stones remember, unless, of course, those who hold the plates know the full story and choose to keep it locked away in silence. Among the most unsettling fragments of the forgotten world are those that hint at machines, not the levers, pulleys, and simple tools expected of early societies, but devices whose complexity suggests a level of engineering that should not have existed in prehistory. To the archaeologist's eye, a machine is a dangerous word, for it implies industrial technology in an age when most cultures were still shaping stone tools. Yet there are artifacts and depictions, some public, some whispered about, that suggest mechanical ingenuity far older than the accepted timeline allows. The most famous and least disputed example is the Antikythera mechanism, a Greek bronze device recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of Crete and dated to around 100 BCE. Consisting of intricate gears and dials, it could track astronomical cycles with precision unmatched until the development of advanced clockworks in the medieval period. Its existence proves that ancient engineers could produce geared mechanisms, but it also raises a troubling question. If such skill existed in the ancient world, what earlier experiments have been lost? The Vatican's possible connection to older machines is tied to its history of receiving unusual artifacts from missionaries and explorers. In the catalogues of the Archivum Secretum, there is an entry for instrumentum ex aer, figura insolita, inventum in ruinis deserti orientalis, instrument of bronze, unusual shape, found in ruins of the eastern desert. The record, dated to the late 18th century, offers no description beyond a rough sketch. A circular frame with evenly spaced teeth along its edge, connected to a central hub by radiating arms. Whether this was part of a known device, an ornamental piece, or something else entirely is not clear. A strange event in 1908 adds more intrigue. That year, a Jesuit archaeological team excavating near the ancient city of Ctesiphon reportedly found a series of cylindrical objects made of a copper shell, an iron rod, and traces of bitumen, similar to what would later be called the Baghdad batteries. These artifacts, if authentic, could have produced small electrical charges when filled with acidic liquid. While mainstream archaeology regards them as possible galvanic cells used for electroplating, their existence in antiquity remains speculative. The Jesuit team's report sent to Rome never appeared in published form, though fragments of the correspondence survive in private archives. The factual anchor here is that ancient engineering was often more advanced than assumed. Roman concrete, for example, has proven more durable than many modern formulations. Water-lifting devices like the shaduf and the Archimedean screw appear in multiple ancient cultures. Historians still debate whether more complex devices, beyond what has been recovered, once existed and were lost to time. Off-topic but related are a set of carved reliefs in the Hathor Temple at Dendera, Egypt, which some fringe interpretations claim depict large electric lamps. Mainstream Egyptology rejects this, identifying the images as lotus flowers and serpents in symbolic form. Yet in private, a handful of engineers have noted similarities between the reliefs and certain high-voltage discharge tubes. Whether this is coincidence, symbol, or deliberate representation of lost technology remains unresolved. The hypothesis entertained by some independent researchers is that fragments of ancient machines survive, scattered across museums and private collections, unrecognized for what they are. If the Vatican holds any such items, it would be consistent with its centuries-long role as custodian of unusual finds. In many cases, such artifacts might be locked away not out of conspiracy, but because they lack sufficient context to be understood, or because revealing them could unleash waves of speculation without definitive answers. Historians still debate whether human technological development has been a steady climb or a series of peaks and collapses. The existence of isolated high-skill artifacts in low-technology contexts supports the latter view. Moments of brilliance that did not spread, perhaps because their creators were part of small, specialized groups whose knowledge died with them. In the dim light of a vault beneath St. Peter's, there may rest a small bronze wheel, its teeth worn smooth by ages, still faintly oily to the touch, as if it once turned in the heart of a forgotten mechanism. Beside it perhaps lies a bundle of sketches made by a long-dead scholar who tried, and failed, to reconstruct its purpose. The wheel may have powered nothing more than a calendar, or it may have been a part of something far stranger. Until the box is opened, the machine remains only a silent witness to a chapter of history that official timelines do not acknowledge. Long before the age of satellites and laser surveying, before theodolites and GPS, there were those who measured the Earth with astonishing precision. They could determine latitude without crossing oceans, align monuments to cardinal points with almost no margin of error, and, in some cases, seem to have known the true circumference of the planet thousands of years before such figures appeared in accepted history. This is the mystery of the circle that measures the world, the arcane geodetic knowledge that appears unexpectedly in the ancient record, and which some believe has roots in an even older hidden tradition. The factual anchor here is the well-documented precision of certain ancient sites. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, is aligned to true north with an accuracy within a fraction of a degree. Stonehenge's layout marks solstices with millimetre-level consistency. The Nazca lines of Peru extend perfectly straight for kilometres over uneven terrain. Historians still debate whether such feats required advanced surveying methods, or could have been achieved through trial, error, and celestial observation. The Vatican's rumoured link to this mystery lies in a set of manuscripts described in its internal geographic catalogues as Tabulae Mensurae Mundi Antiquissimae, tables of the most ancient measurement of the world. These are said to contain numerical data recorded in a base 60 system, similar to that of the Sumerians, which describe distances between key points on Earth's surface with remarkable accuracy. The provenance of these tables is listed only as ex charti orientalibus from Eastern charts, with no surviving reference to the original maps from which they were supposedly derived. A strange event from the 1930s adds an intriguing detail. During an excavation in the Sinai Peninsula, a Franciscan field assistant claimed to have seen a flat stone slab carved with concentric circles, intersected by radial lines, each line tipped with symbols resembling mountains, rivers, or suns. Around the outermost circle were numbers in a non-Arabic, non-Roman script. The slab was reportedly shipped to a research facility in Europe, but according to internal correspondence, it was loaned to a Vatican scholar for study. It has not been publicly seen since. An off-topic but relevant curiosity comes from the Eratosthenes calculation. In the 3rd century BCE, the Greek scholar famously calculated the Earth's circumference to within a small percentage of the modern value using only shadow measurements and geometry. While this is celebrated as a triumph of independent reasoning, some researchers note that his figures align suspiciously well with certain earlier, unverified claims attributed to Egyptian temple records. Whether coincidence or the passing down of older knowledge, it hints that advanced geodetic information may have existed long before Eratosthenes formalized it. The hypothesis entertained by more speculative historians is that a pre-Sumerian civilization developed a network of fixed observation points, perhaps marked by standing stones or monuments, to measure Earth's size and geography. Such a network could explain the recurring appearance of megalithic sites aligned not only to celestial events, but also to one another across vast distances. If the Vatican possesses fragments of records from this network, measurements, diagrams, or even small models, they would represent some of the most significant evidence for advanced prehistoric science. Historians still debate whether the similarities in site alignments across continents are evidence of shared knowledge or the inevitable result of similar astronomical needs. Yet when specific numeric ratios, such as the 360-degree division of the circle or the precise length of a degree of latitude, appear in disparate cultures, the possibility of cultural inheritance cannot be dismissed entirely. Why would such records be kept hidden? Theological reasons are possible. Precise global measurements before the recognized dawn of science might challenge traditional narratives of human development. But there are also pragmatic concerns. Releasing partial data without understanding its full context could invite misuse, overinterpretation, or the fueling of unfounded theories. In the quiet heart of the Vatican's deep archives, there could be a scroll, a faded parchment covered in neat columns of numbers, each paired with symbols representing places now buried under seas or deserts. The numbers might match the distances between ancient monuments, or between long-forgotten markers aligned to the stars. If genuine, they would prove that someone, long before history began, had already traced the curve of the Earth, and understood that our world was a sphere, measurable, knowable, and finite. Before Prometheus stole fire in Greek myth, before the hearth became the centre of the home, there may have been other forms of mastery over heat and energy, knowledge that served not only for cooking or warmth, but for processes whose purposes we no longer understand. The phrase "the sacred fire before Prometheus" has been used by a handful of scholars to describe evidence scattered across archaeology and myth of advanced thermal technologies in deep prehistory. To some, this is merely a poetic way of speaking about early metallurgy and ceramics. But to others, and in certain whispered claims about Vatican holdings, it refers to something stranger, the deliberate harnessing of energy in ways that should not have been possible for the time. The factual anchor lies in known archaeological anomalies of ancient heat manipulation. At sites like Jericho and Çatalhöyük, plastered floors show signs of sustained high-temperature firing that seems excessive for simple domestic use. In southern Turkey's Neolithic layers, archaeologists have found kilns capable of reaching temperatures suitable for metal, smelting centuries before the first copper artifacts appear. Even more puzzling is vitrified stone, walls in Scotland, France, and the Near East that have been partially melted into glass. Historians still debate whether this vitrification was intentional, perhaps for fortification, or the byproduct of catastrophic fires. The Vatican's supposed connection comes from a small, rarely mentioned collection catalogued under Instrumenta Ignis Antiquissimi, instruments of the most ancient fire. These are described in internal Latin inventories as ceramic and metallic vessels lined with unknown glaze, capable of retaining extreme heat. No further details are given, and their listed origin points are vague, from the eastern deserts and from the southern islands. The implication is that they may have been retrieved during missionary expeditions or acquired through private donation. A strange event in 1897 adds an intriguing thread. That year, a Benedictine missionary working near the ruins of an ancient fortress in Sudan reported finding a black glassy basin embedded in the ground. It was so perfectly hemispherical and so resistant to scratching that local workers compared it to the heart of a meteor. The missionary noted that the soil around it was fused into a hardened crust, as if exposed to sudden and extreme heat. The basin was cut free and shipped to Rome under the pretext of mineralogical examination. No public record of its analysis survives. Off-topic but relevant is the long-debated claim about the Ark of the Covenant's supposed dangerous glory, a biblical tradition that some interpret as describing high-voltage discharges or intense heat. While mainstream theology treats such descriptions as symbolic or miraculous, a handful of historians have suggested they could be poetic echoes of ancient, powerful energy devices. Whether or not the Ark was real, such myths suggest that the concept of sacred, dangerous energy has been with humanity since its earliest stories. The hypothesis favoured by more speculative researchers is that certain ancient societies may have stumbled upon or inherited techniques for producing and containing extreme heat or energy for specialised purposes. This could include the firing of rare ceramics, the processing of ores unknown to their contemporaries, or even rudimentary chemical or electrical experiments. If such knowledge existed, it may have been ritualised, its practical function wrapped in religious ceremony, and its artefacts preserved as sacred relics. Historians still debate whether vitrification and other extreme heat phenomena can be explained entirely by natural or accidental fires. Some suggest lightning strikes, or the burning of massive wooden structures as possible causes. But in several cases, the distribution and patterning of the heat damage appears deliberate, as though applied in controlled conditions. Why would the Vatican keep such artifacts hidden? Beyond their fragility and lack of context, there is the matter of interpretation. Without clear evidence, a vitrified basin or a high-temperature vessel could invite a storm of speculation, from alien theories to dangerous pseudoscience. Better, perhaps, to keep such pieces preserved but unseen, until a time when they can be studied without distortion. In the lamplit stillness of the archives, one can imagine a shelf lined with small, unassuming objects, a bowl with a glaze that has resisted decay for millennia, a shard of stone whose surface is rippled and glassy, a lump of fused material that might once have been brick. To the untrained eye, they are curiosities, but to the few who have examined them closely, they might represent the last physical proof of a mastery of fire that came and was lost, long before Prometheus ever entered the stage of myth. In the chronicles of the Late Bronze Age, history records a shadowy force known only by the name given them by their enemies, the Sea Peoples. They arrive from the horizon in waves of ships, striking coasts from Anatolia to Egypt, leaving destruction in their wake. Their origins remain uncertain even today, with theories ranging from displaced Mediterranean tribes to the remnants of collapsed kingdoms. But in certain alternative histories, and in whispers attached to the Vatican's more obscure archives, there is an older, more unsettling suggestion that the Sea Peoples were not a unique phenomenon of the Late Bronze Age at all, but the last survivors of a far earlier maritime civilization, one whose memory reaches back before the dawn of written history. The factual anchor here is the archaeological record of advanced seafaring in deep antiquity. Obsidian from the island of Melos reached mainland Greece over 9,000 years ago. Lapita culture pottery is found scattered across thousands of kilometres of the Pacific. Egyptian trade routes reached the distant land of Punt more than 3,000 years ago. Historians still debate whether early seafarers were isolated cases of innovation, or part of longer, interconnected traditions stretching back to a time before agriculture was widespread. The Vatican's name enters this particular narrative through a curious 15th century manuscript, catalogued under Itinerarium Antiquissimum Maris, the most ancient itinerary of the sea. The text, written in careful Latin, purports to be a translation of a much older log, describing islands where the sun rises twice, and shores where towers stand like teeth against the waves. The descriptions do not match any known late Bronze Age accounts. More disturbingly, some match submerged topographies revealed by modern sonar, banks and plateaus that would have been dry land before the end of the last ice age. A strange event in 1911 lends weight to the rumour. That year, a Franciscan friar stationed on a small island in the central Mediterranean wrote to Rome claiming that fishermen had recovered a bronze prow ornament from shallow waters after a storm. The piece depicted a human figure wearing a crested helmet and holding what appeared to be a stylized sun disk. Local elders insisted the object was not Phoenician or Greek, but from the old ships before the ones in the stories. The friar sent the ornament to the Vatican's collection. The shipping receipt survives, but no public record of the artifact exists. Off-topic but noteworthy are the many rock carvings found along coastlines in Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the western Mediterranean showing long, sleek boats with high prows. Some of these carvings date to thousands of years before the known sea peoples. While these could represent simple fishing craft, their scale and stylization hint at vessels designed for long-distance travel, a feature that would not be out of place in a global maritime culture. The hypothesis entertained by some is that an early seafaring network existed in the millennia after the last ice age, when coastlines were vastly different. Rising seas would have drowned many of their harbours, forcing survivors inland or onto islands. In such a scenario, the sea peoples of later history could have been cultural heirs, inheriting shipbuilding techniques, navigational knowledge, and perhaps even fragments of old maps. If the Vatican possesses artifacts or records from this earlier horizon, they might be the only surviving material evidence of that inheritance. Historians still debate the exact origins of the sea peoples. Egyptian inscriptions call them by names such as Sherdon, Shekelesh, and Peliset, but give no clear homeland. Some scholars believe they were a confederation of displaced groups, united by circumstance rather than culture. Others argue for a shared ancestry, rooted in an older maritime tradition, one that may have spanned the Mediterranean and beyond. Why might the Vatican withhold such materials? Maritime heritage carries geopolitical weight. Ancient claims to islands, waters, and routes could become contentious in modern politics. Additionally, evidence of an advanced maritime network predating recorded civilization would challenge the long-held view that early humans were largely land-bound until relatively late in their development. In a darkened storeroom deep beneath Vatican City, perhaps there rests a long, narrow crate. Inside, cushioned against the sentries, lies a corroded bronze figurehead, the stylized face of a mariner from an age before written history, its gaze still fixed on the endless horizon. If it could speak, it might tell of voyages across seas whose shapes no longer match our maps, and of a people who measured their world not by the land they held, but by the waters they could cross. Every civilization has its twilight, a moment when its light dims and the record of its existence begins to fade. In the accepted history of the world, these declines are attributed to familiar forces: drought, famine, invasion, disease. But in the case of the so-called Dawn Age, that hypothesized pre-Sumerian horizon hinted at in fragments, artifacts, and whispered Vatican inventories, there is no single, clear cause. Instead, what remains is an incomplete puzzle of calamities, each capable of erasing a people, converging until the entire age slipped beneath the surface of history. The factual anchor here comes from the archaeological record of sudden cultural disappearances. The Varna culture of the western Black Sea, famed for its gold work, vanished around 4500 BCE. The Cucuteni Tropilia settlements in Eastern Europe, with their vast proto-cities and intricate pottery, collapsed after 3000 BCE. Across the globe, parallel stories exist. Advanced material cultures that rose abruptly and then ceased without obvious succession. Historians still debate whether these collapses were caused by climate change, resource depletion, or conflict. The Vatican's possible link to the disappearance of the Dawn Age appears in a restricted document sometimes referred to by archivists as tabula ultima, the last record. The inventory note describes it as a vellum copy of ancient logics of decline, listing a sequence of disasters translated from older texts in a tongue no longer spoken. The sequence is chilling: the ash from the sky, the waters that came in one season, the sickness of the fields, and finally, the darkness of trade. Each entry is marked with symbols that some scholars privately compare to glyphs found on artifacts in both the Near East and South Asia. A strange event in 1924 seems to brush against this shadowed history. That year, an Italian ethnographer in the Levant recorded the oral history of a nomadic group whose elders claimed descent from the people of the Red City, a place said to have been destroyed when the four signs came in one lifetime. The ethnographer's notes compare these four signs — fire, flood, crop failure, and trade collapse — to the sequence described in Tabula Ultima. The notes were sent to Rome as part of the ethnographer's regular reporting, but he never received a reply. Off topic, but worth noting, are paleoclimate studies showing that around the mid-Holocene, a series of abrupt climate shifts occurred, including the 5.9 kiloyear event, a rapid drying period believed to have contributed to the fall of Egypt's Old Kingdom and the Akkadian Empire. If such changes struck a complex maritime-linked Dawn Age civilization, the effects could have been catastrophic, especially if coupled with natural disasters and disease. The hypothesis most consistent with these fragments is that the Dawn Age was not erased by a single blow, but by a sequence of overlapping crises. In a world without global communication, each region may have perceived its own collapse as unique, not realizing that other centers were falling at the same time. Only in the records of a far-flung trade or religious network, perhaps preserved in the kind of master archive the Vatican is rumored to possess, could the pattern be seen as a whole. Historians still debate whether such patterns are real, or the result of our tendency to link unrelated events into narratives. Yet if the Tabula Ultima exists, it would be one of the few documents to describe a global collapse before recorded history, and to do so from the perspective of those who lived through it. Why might such a document remain hidden? Its implications would ripple beyond archaeology. A detailed account of a global prehistoric collapse could reframe debates about our own vulnerability to cascading disasters. It might also invite perilous speculation about the technologies, alliances, or conflicts of a civilization that left so little behind. Deep within the Vatican's most secure chambers, perhaps a flat bundle of vellum lies bound in faded red cord. On its first page, in letters copied by a medieval scribe, are four unadorned symbols: fire, wave, stalk, and wheel, representing the four signs of the end. Beneath them, a single line might read, "And so the cities of the First Age were no more." In the architecture of the Vatican's most restricted vaults, there is said to be a single chamber without windows or decoration. Its walls are lined not with shelves, but with tall cabinets of blackened wood, each locked with ironwork so intricate it could be considered art. Within one of these cabinets, so the whispers go, rests a single object known among a handful of archivists as the Sealed Testament of Ages. It is not a book in the ordinary sense, but a compilation, a collection of copied fragments, sketches, and translated passages gathered from dozens of sources across centuries, bound together as a coherent whole. If the rumours are to be believed, it ties every scattered clue, every anomalous artifact, every strange manuscript into the outline of a single, astonishing narrative. The factual anchor for this part lies in the Vatican's well-documented history of producing compendia. Over the centuries, its scholars have assembled great codices that bring together diverse sources into single volumes, theological syntheses, philosophical concordances, even encyclopedias of natural history drawn from both Christian and pre-Christian texts. If a Dawn Age civilization had once existed, it would be consistent with Vatican archival practice to consolidate all related material into one master reference, even if it were never intended for public release. The The sealed testament, if real, would begin in deep antiquity, describing a network of cities, maritime routes, and knowledge centres that flourished before Sumer's first bricks were laid. It would outline their sciences, from proto-writing to metallurgy, from the mapping of the heavens to the measurement of the earth. It would record the catastrophes that befell them, the fires from the sky, the rising seas, the drying fields, and the unravelling of trade. And crucially, it would track their survivors, not in broad mythic strokes, but in lineages, migrations, and the quiet transfer of skills into the hands of the younger civilizations. A strange event from the 1950s feeds the legend. A Jesuit historian, tasked with cataloguing certain miscellaneous manuscripts, reportedly found himself working from excerpts that, while labelled in Latin, included detailed drawings of coastlines and city plans not matching any known geography. Marginal notes identified the source simply as Tie Tatis Primae, Testament of the First Age. According to an account later shared with a trusted colleague, the historian was allowed to see only a portion of the manuscript before it was taken away for higher review. Within a year, he had been reassigned to missionary work abroad, and the colleague who recounted the story never saw him again. Off-topic but relevant are the recurring traditions across cultures of a book of origins, a single, sacred record that contains the truth of the world's beginnings. In Mesoamerican myth, the Popol Vuh holds the creation story of the Kichi Maya. In Mesopotamia, the Enuma Elish combines cosmogony with the ordering of kingship. The sealed testament, if it exists, would be an artifact of similar cultural gravity, but not tied to one people alone. It would be a global book of origins, its pages an atlas of a world we have forgotten. The hypothesis among the few who dare to speak of it is that such a compilation, even in fragmentary form, would irrevocably alter our understanding of human history. It would prove that civilization is not a single ascent from primitive to advanced, but a cycle, rising, falling, and rising again. That Sumer was not the beginning, but a restart. That the skills we think of as modern are, in fact, recoveries from older heights. Historians still debate whether a single source could exist to unite the disparate anomalies we see today. The pre-Sumerian ruins, the anomalous maps, the inexplicable metallurgy, the advanced geodesy. Mainstream scholarship leans toward coincidence, independent invention, and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But if the sealed testament were real, it would transform coincidence into chronology and pattern into proof. Why would the Vatican keep it hidden? Beyond the theological shock to established narratives, there would be practical concerns. The sudden revaluation of ancient sites, the rush to excavate fragile regions, the political consequences of redrawing the deep past. And perhaps, most fundamentally, the fear that revealing a cycle of civilizational rise and collapse would cast a shadow over our present, a reminder that decline is not an accident of history but its rhythm. In the imagined silence of that locked chamber, one could picture the sealed testament resting in its case, a thick binding of weathered leather, its spine unmarked, its pages edged in gold leaf so worn that only faint traces remain. If ever brought to the light, it might tell the entire story from the first sparks of the dawn age to its final embers, and the faint glow carried forward into Sumer, Egypt, and all that followed. But for now the testament sleeps, and with it sleeps the possibility of knowing, not just guessing, what came before the first chapter of recorded history. Night settles over the imagined vaults, and over the plains where the first stones once stood, and the long thread of the narrative loosens until it drifts like a ribbon in still air. The rooms beneath the marble remain closed. Their hinges do not turn, their guardians do not stir, and whatever rests inside them breathes only the quiet breath of paper and dust. Above ground, the world keeps its ordinary rhythm, lamps in windows, the hush of streets after evening rain, the gentle weight of sleep approaching, and the older questions fold themselves into that soft, familiar darkness. What has been told becomes a low tide of memory. Cities with ringed harbours and gardens now seabeds, maps inked with coastlines that no longer exist, star tables lit by oils that burnt out long ago, bones lifted from wrong layers and cradled in cautious hands, alloys that gleamed when the deserts were green. Each fragment finds another, and together they suggest a silhouette more than a solid figure, the outline of a civilization that may have grown, and learned, and faltered, and finally vanished, leaving its quiet signals to pass from keeper to keeper. The mind grows calmer as the pieces take their places. Certainty is not required, only the kind of patience that lets unanswered things rest without fear, and the kind of composure that allows wonder to remain wonder, unforced and unharmed. If the sealed cabinet is ever opened, it will open in its time. If not, the story still offers a harbour for thought, a gentle bay where questions can anchor and drift without storm. Breath slows, rooms dimension. The last image lingers, a single page, turned by a careful hand, and the faintest murmur of vellum as it lies flat. The page does not vanish, it simply quiets, and with it, the long road of the tale grows soft and still. Good night.